Video conferencing, and MFA. Sponsored by Highside. My name is Carol Auth of SANS. Today's featured speakers are Dave Shackleford, SANS Senior Instructor, and Aaron Turner, President and CSO at Highside, and he will be moderating today's webcast. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Aaron.
Thank you very much, Carol. Good to speak to the SANS audience. Always a pleasure to be able to have this opportunity to interface with a bunch of really smart security folks, and also really great to connect with my friend and colleague, Dave. What we're going to be walking through today is basically a view into what really matters when you're thinking about how you communicate in these times of remote working, whether that's through messaging or video conferencing, and also the importance of protecting digital identities in this time when everyone's working remote. So some of the things that I wanted to talk about with Dave here is basically a lot of people don't understand how important the provenance of these technologies is. And by provenance, it's a fancy word for where does this thing come from? Where is it developed? Where is it authorized for use? Who has access to the data that's stored in the system that you're using for collaboration? And how easily is it compromised? As we've looked at remote working now, there's been a lot of companies who have had to do the ready, fire, aim approach, where they've essentially had to use something that's ended up putting their information at risk because they focused on availability. And in the rapid towards remote working, it was more about what can we get up and running quickly and efficiently, not necessarily what is going to protect our information and give us the confidentiality and integrity that we need. So from your perspective, Dave, what have you seen out there? Have you seen any mistakes from your perspective when it comes to decisions people have made about remote working tools?
Yeah, it's interesting when you were even just going through the intro. I know, we've chatted about this, sort of topic for years, and it feels like the circumstances surrounding us now. Obviously, nobody had foresight into a global pandemic coming about in the last couple months, right? So, one of the things that's really been a topic of discussion is just those sort of oversights that nobody was thinking through. Everybody goes through their DR planning and their continuity planning and really just their mode or modality of how they get work done. And most, let's face it, most organizations have had some sort of remote working facilitation to at least some degree for quite a while now. But nobody foresaw all of them, all of our employees, every single person necessarily now having to work remotely. And to your point, it feels like it was sort of like their backs were up against the wall, and a lot of organizations had to make some decisions. It felt like sort of on a dime, like they had to make a quick call to do something to either augment their existing infrastructure or pick something that was capable of, sort of supporting the entire spectrum of their workforce very quickly. And candidly, from at least where I sat, I didn't see almost any real in-depth risk assessment being performed against the sort of core engine of, number one, where this was being built, who had access to it, and where it was even operating from. I think that was just glossed over, even with some of my most mature clients.
Yeah, as I've been doing research for some of my consulting clients and with the folks we've been working with through Highside, people have had to really dig in, especially in organizations that handle regulated data, to understand where exactly is my information flowing. So for example, we had one customer who was using Slack to do some interesting development work. This development work impacted some systems that were controlling export controlled data. And so as they went looking through Slack, what a lot of people don't realize about Slack is that Slack monetizes the data that flows through its public platform. Slack actually has an entry in its Security and Exchange Commission documents that basically says we do not protect your data in the default platform. They have some systems and processes you can go through to protect data, but essentially whatever you're sending through Slack is essentially like shouting it in a public place, because Slack's going to monetize that, and there's no real protection as it flows through that system. The same thing holds true for tools like Zoom and Teams, Microsoft Teams, because those systems were mainly developed for availability, not necessarily for confidentiality and integrity. And so as people have tried to dig into answering those questions about, well, where is this technology developed and who has access to it when it flows through that cloud system on the back end? When it comes to the way that we viewed the problems, a lot of folks don't have the sophistication within an enterprise to ask those tough questions. And a lot of times, because of the ready, fire, aim momentum that organizations have, they don't really have the ability to pump the brakes and go, hey, wait a second, we need to have maybe a secure alternative for our board meetings or for conversations for the security operations team. The most disturbing situation that we've seen is where people were sharing, a security operations team was sharing information regarding an incident of an individual who had full control. They were a global admin in the Office 365 deployment. And this person, basically, because of their global admin privileges in Office 365, they could read everything that was being shared through Teams. And so there was no ability to isolate that information from that individual. We've seen all sorts of SMS attacks, people sort of degrading their communications for the sake of availability using WhatsApp or Signal, Facebook Messenger, iMessage, that sort of thing. And then, we'll talk a little bit later about what does it mean when you've decided to use an identity as a service provider like Okta or Duo or any of those out there. But I think what attackers are doing now is they're taking advantage of the inordinate amount of trust that people are giving to these systems, and I think it results in some bad things. So one of the ones that we've focused on with some of our partners as we've helped to solve some of these problems is what happened to Boris Johnson and his cabinet team in the United Kingdom a couple of weeks ago. He tweeted out this photo that said, hey, we're getting the work done, but unfortunately, Zoom has a static identifier, and so now anybody knew which Zoom conference the UK cabinet was using for their very important decisions they were making. And the fact that Zoom has shared all their encryption keys with the Chinese military, and we basically see situations where Zoom's application source code is probably going to be fully released in its entirety to manipulate any Zoom session. So, Dave, from your perspective, what did you think when you saw Boris Johnson's Zoom meeting getting tweeted out?
So this was fascinating to me, right? I mean, this was sort of like the OPSEC cry heard around the world. Out on Twitter, everybody was immediately talking about just, face palm situation and so forth. But to be fair, I think there's a lot of things to look at here. I mean, number one, the head of a country sort of, you'd think he'd be getting advised by somebody in the intelligence community or, people that were associated with, the British intelligence agencies over there to say, hey, look, this is how you've got to do things. I mean, I look at Zoom personally. So I look at Zoom personally as almost much more of a consumer-oriented type of platform. Is it resilient? Is it available? Is it scalable? Sure. But I had some great conversations with people about this, sort of when it went down. And, obviously, there was this huge outcry. Oh, my gosh, how in the world could he have done this? But aside from that, I think the other factor you have to look at is, well, is Zoom acceptable for having a quick chat with your grandmother? Right, to keep in touch? Absolutely, right? Of course, who cares, right? If you're calling your grandma and you just want to have a chat, I don't think anybody really cares, frankly, about the security orientation of what's going on. You're not having a highly sensitive conversation with your grandmother, probably. But if you're the head of state for a country, one of the world's most powerful countries, this is an entirely different conversation that we're having. So not only was it the fact that he's just sort of, putting this information out there that anybody could have just joined up and hung out with Boris and crew for a bit. Number two, why was he using Zoom in the first place? Right? I mean, look, this is one of those that I just still can't get my head around that it even happened at all, personally.
Yeah, so from my perspective, I see that here's a group of people who are rapidly physically isolating themselves, who obviously did not have access to the appropriate information security consultants or advisors to help them make good decisions. And so, I don't want to throw too much shade at Zoom because some very important decisions had to be made very, very rapidly, and it was more important that those decisions be made through some medium. But I think people have to understand that there are some significant problems that I think that go above and beyond just perceiving Zoom as a consumer platform. So for example, Zoom's principal technology research and development center is located in the People's Republic of China. And when you do that, the developer, in this case Zoom, has to comply with all the counterterrorism and encryption compliance regulations when you put full-time employees there, which means every single encryption key has to be either derived from Chinese provided seed material, or all the private keys have to be shared with the Chinese government upon request. And so this goes much further beyond just, oh, it's good to talk to your grandma. Zoom is probably one of the Chinese government's best intelligence gathering mechanisms that they have access to right now. This is a critical component of their information gathering capabilities that they're using actively right now to contemplate what they're going to do. There's going to be some really, really important decisions that are going to have to be made on a geopolitical basis about, the Trump administration is probably going to pull some crazy stuff in the next few months to politically out of the mess that the United States government's in. And I would say is Trump's attempt to try to win the election this fall, to throw as much shade as possible towards the Chinese. So I think people have to realize that Zoom is an actively compromised platform, not just it's good for consumers. And that's because of the fact that they had to put their research and development center there in the People's Republic of China. So Dave, have you ever worked with folks that have had R&D locations there in China and seen what goes on there?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not pretty. I mean, that's a cliche, I think, at this point, but it is actually all true. I mean, there is no transparency whatsoever with regard to how that whole situation actually works. I mean, the Chinese government, it's very binary, right? You're either going to have X if you want to be there or not. So I look at that and I think it's a fair point. But let me ask you something, Aaron, because I think this is actually a fairly important thing to make a distinction around. We're talking about Zoom. We're going to talk about some others. The thing that I also have found with a lot of organizations that were being sort of thrust into this position, and nobody wanted to be being put into this position, but it felt like there was such an incredibly limited set of choices. Truthfully, as an enterprise collaboration platform, I mean, if you're an average corporation, globally in Europe or North America, wherever, how many are there? How many real, sort of selections or options do you feel like people felt they had or were immediately familiar with? And I can at least speak from my experience. It was an extremely small number of collaboration platforms that even bubbled up in terms of selection. People didn't go out there and really do any research. I don't want to say they didn't do any, but I mean, they didn't say, oh, okay, let's take our time. Again, it was a dire situation. They said, we need something now. So somebody comes to the table with what's available, quote unquote, now. And it really felt like it was the same old players all over again.
Well, and here's ancient history from my background. I was at Microsoft when the first unified communications platform was bolted onto Exchange. This would have been 2005 timeframe, where Exchange Server was going to get your voicemails and automatically transcode them to text, and you're going to have this one thing in your Exchange mailbox, and you could send out an invitation, and it would send you a Microsoft Link invitation. And anyone who tried to run their business on Microsoft Link would tell you that that was like punching yourself in the face, because it just didn't work. The technology was not baked enough. And so then you go through the situation where Microsoft acquires Skype, and then Skype for Business happens, but then it was really just a rebranding, not a redoing of the code base. And then you've got the WebExes and the GoToMeetings and the all of the different hardware players who are trying to sell their own stuff. And so I think the reason why we were in the situation where Zoom became the predominant tool was because Zoom was the only one who had ever tried to do something to make it available on all platforms, and where availability was the key criteria. So, the Cisco, when WebEx got acquired by Cisco, Cisco tried to make that a hardware play where you had to buy the Cisco WebEx TVs and cameras and phones and all this stuff. And so because of what I'll call the matchings of the different corporate players in the unified communications and teleconferencing space, none of it was incompatible. It wouldn't work with each other. And so Zoom was really the only platform people could go, okay, this works on iOS, it works on Android, it works on Windows, it works on Mac. Okay, let's do it. And I think that's why Zoom won so big, was because they were the only ones that didn't have a self-interest to try to sell hardware. And what's interesting is the founder of Zoom is an ex-WebEx guy. So he basically got disgruntled when WebEx got acquired by Cisco and basically ran with it. And so I think because of his focus on availability on all platforms, that's the reason why Zoom won in the last quarter.
I think that's true. I think that's a fair point, right? And it's easy. Let's get it out there. I mean, Zoom is incredibly simple to set up. As a matter of fact, my daughter in university had to do an interview with somebody as part of one of her colleges, and it went on today over Zoom. And she was like, "Well, how do I use Zoom?" 30 seconds later, she was using Zoom. And it was just, it struck me, ease of use, simplicity, and to your point, multi-platform support, does tend to win. So I agree with you.
And really the big loser was Google. Google has sort of punched themselves in the face over the last 10 years when it comes to remote collaboration. And, they're on their 5th rebranding of what they're now calling Meet, which was Hangouts, which was Duo, which was whatever the hell they called it before. And so, what's interesting is the simplicity of Zoom leads to its security problems because of the Zoom static nature of meeting IDs and easily deciphered passwords. There was a really interesting report that Brian Krebs published last month on the Z War Dial tool, where basically it's a hacking tool that's designed to predict people's Zoom meeting IDs, and also to reverse engineer the passwords, right? So as soon as you've got a war dialing tool pointed against you, man, it is going to be tough to get it to overcome that.
When I saw this is like the old schooler in me coming back. Maybe you had the same feeling, but this actually, so it's bad. Let's just get it out there, right? The fact that this, to your point, as soon as somebody cranks up a full-on brute forcing engine against your meetings, you got new problems that you probably didn't realize. But, the fact that somebody, sort of created a war dial emulator, this brought me squarely back to the 90s, right? Like this, that's me speaking here, remembering, the origination of a war dialer in the first place. And it's the same concept. It's amazing how these things sort of come back around in like a new form factor. So yeah, it's just as terrible as it was when people were doing the same thing against modems.
Yep. And what people don't understand about Zoom is that all of the secrets have to be mailed in an email where the secrets are essentially in the clear in the email. So even if you have a quote unquote password protected Zoom meeting, we saw one incident last month where a malicious Office 365 administrator used the Exchange Online DLP script to scrape the Zoom meeting passwords out of all of the executive stuff so he could listen in to the executive meetings about who was getting fired, with the massive reduction in force that's going on in some of these employers. And so basically, static meeting IDs plus passwords, that's, recipe for disaster, right?
Yeah, that's a whole new insider threat mojo. Yeah, that's a great example.
So, Microsoft Teams, another one that's having problems here. They also rely on simple static identifiers. The network encryption that Teams uses is very easily defeated. It's the old school pre-TLS 2.0 stuff that they use to protect the stuff that's passing over the wire. And, everything that flows through Microsoft Teams, it's all readable by Office 365 global admins. I already mentioned it, that incident where a security operations team was trying to clean up the mess of a rogue Office 365 global admin, but the global admin was reading all of their team's messages as they were trying to coordinate the incident, right? So, how are you going to stay one step ahead of the people you're trying to shut down when they are global admins and can read everything that's going on? And so, that's the bad side of Teams, is that in order to play nice within the Office ecosystem, the Office 365 ecosystem, all of that data has to be decrypted, and it is kept in an unencrypted state on the back end, and that can lead to badness, especially in regulated situations. We were dealing with one customer that tried to get a BAA signed with Microsoft for personal health information for HIPAA compliance. Microsoft won't sign BAAs because they know that they can't take that liability. So a good indicator when you're trying to choose something is if the provider will not sign a BAA to protect personal health information, probably not a good idea to go into that. The last bit that we've just, go ahead.
No, I was actually just going to make one other point on the whole global admin thing too, which is, it's part of an ecosystem, to your point. And I've done a bunch of assessments on, client organizations that are working in Office 365. And I'd say almost ubiquitously across the board, there's an extreme overallocation of that role, right? You have to have global admin privileges to do really almost anything related to IT. Security people have that role. IT operators have that role. Exchange folks have that. Like it's way overallocated. And when you sort of piece those things together, right, you've got access to things that you may not have even realized you had access to. It paints a pretty grim picture for a lot, especially larger organizations out there.
Well, and that's the monster. That's the Frankenstein monster that's been created for anyone who's tried to set up an Office 365 or an AWS or an Azure admin account. You go in and you see literally like hundreds of different options that you can choose. And so what most organizations do, I call it global admin fatigue, where they go, I don't know what permissions this guy needs. Global admin. I'm just going to make him global admin. And because of that overprivileging, there's no risk to that. What could possibly go wrong? And so, it really becomes that situation where that overprivileging results in lack of integrity for any information that's shared through that system. So this slide here I wanted to bring up, in our research, if your conferencing system has a browser link, then it's essentially vulnerable to 130 organizations in 30 countries around the world to intercept everything that's going through that thing. Because if there's a browser link, then that means that there's a browser plugin. And if there's a browser plugin, then all sorts of badness can happen. These 30 countries are ones that we've mapped where on mobile platforms and on most browsers, you see pre-compromised roots of trust that have been deployed to those systems that allow these countries to intercept everything. And so why in the world should Venezuela have the right to listen to your conference, right? What could possibly go wrong there? We all know that China has this capability, but what's interesting is some research that we did where the Iranians have been working with a French company to get this capability too. And so, you've got some really bad actors out there who have the capability to intercept anything that flows through a browser link when it comes to these conferencing systems. And I don't think there's anything good that's going to come out of that for organizations that need to protect their data.
Yeah, not at all. And again, I think you're painting that picture. These things are part of an ecosystem and a web of trust that you can't extricate one from the other. I mean, the way the technology is built is it's completely linked to that. You can't, there's no option.
Yeah. So what a lot of organizations have also done is they've said, well, let's throw caution to the wind. Let's just get stuff done. Let's start using iMessage and FaceTime. Well, one thing you should always ask yourself is if a messaging platform works within the boundaries of the People's Republic of China, then that means it's monitored by the People's Republic of China. So iMessage is a fully authorized tool that can be used in the PRC. Apple has never fully disclosed how they're allowing that monitoring, whether that's at the core or if they're doing a break-off for a separate set. But Apple's lack of transparency there is troubling if you are dealing with information which you would deem sensitive and would not want to share with the People's Republic of China. WhatsApp keys are controlled by Facebook. They're monetized by all the information that flows through WhatsApp is monetized by Facebook with its partners. We know that Facebook has complied with what are called, quote, lawful intercept unquote requests, which basically what happens is an authoritarian regime goes to Facebook and says, hey, I need you to turn over your WhatsApp keys so I can monitor these people. And Facebook's given the choice of either you want to do business in this country or you don't. And they usually want to do business there, so they turn over the keys. And so that's the downside of having a key system like that. Signal also suffers from those kinds of encryption problems because the private key identifiers are based they're based upon your public telephone number. And you've got key material that's sent over SMS networks, and so it's fairly easy to scrape the private keys that get sent when people enable their Signal number. We've already mentioned Slack. They make it known in all of their investment disclosures that they have no security on their platform, and none of these really provide any control over the information that's shared through these systems. So like a conversation have through WhatsApp, once that data is sent, it's lost and it's not traceable anymore. From your perspective, Dave, what have you seen when it comes to shadow IT, people using these consumer messaging platforms?
Yes, that's what I've seen. I mean, that's essentially the story of our lives. I think every single organization I do work in, even like the most highly regulated banks, financial institutions, they have all of these in place. It really is almost a sort of uniform circumstance that you find across the board. I mean, maybe with the exception of Slack. Slack is sort of it tends to be a little bit more piecemeal, but I mean, from, WhatsApp to Signal, FaceTime, all of those are in use, especially in organizations that have a significant BYOD presence, right? Because in those circumstances, people are just like, yeah, this thing is here. It's on my system of choice. It's my mobile device. Of course I'm going to use it. So I think this is a problem that has basically been there the whole time, and it's just escalated in the current circumstances even more.
Yeah, and a lot of this comes down to availability again. People just are trying to, they are self-interested. They're trying to do their job. They're trying to get something done, and they just don't have proper guidance. So without the proper guidance, they end up using something that could subject the organization to some risk. So the last portion that I wanted to dig into is this whole identity as a service situation that we're starting to see. From your perspective, Dave, how broad have you seen Okta penetrate into the customers that you work with?
I'd say easily 50 or more % of my customers are Okta customers. It's huge. It's easily the biggest identity as a service engine out there.
So what was the lesson we learned when all the government agencies were using Secure ID back in 2011, right? If you put all of your keys in one basket, what usually happens to that basket?
It becomes a target.
Just a little
period,
right?
Yep, subtly, yeah.
We were working on a situation with a large financial services player, US-based international bank. They had deployed Okta, and we're still sort of in the user acceptance testing phase, so it wasn't fully, rolled out. But we had hundreds of people on it. It was, more than just a couple of, crazy people running as a test. And one morning, the users came in, and all the users at this global financial services player were being rerouted to College of the Canyons, a community college in Los Angeles County, California. So, needless to say, they weren't interested in registering for community college courses in order to get their global financial services work done. But the indicator there is that somebody had goofed inside of Okta, and what that error resulted in to me was basically saying, this is one massive database that they're maintaining. They claim that they have sort of separation and boundaries between customers, but for economies of scale, once you get that big, you can't build separate data centers, to route all of these different customers to. And so with this massive shared backend, I think it's just a matter of time until we see an RSA Secure ID hack similar to what happened in 2011 that then took down Lockheed Martin and all of the defense industrial-based players. I think we're going to see an Okta attack that is very, very similar, because everyone's stuffing all their stuff in there. But maybe I'm just too curmudgeon-y. Maybe I've just been around too long. I mean,
I wouldn't. I mean, speculation is speculation, right? But it's calculated based on previous experiences, and truth be told, not necessarily even just Okta, but any of these sort of brokering services that, functionally sit somewhere either in the authentication chain or even in the communication chain for organizations that are using cloud services and any other manner of different services out there. I actually talk about this with my SaaS classes all the time. I'm like, look, anytime you choose to basically position a brokered service in the middle of your sensitive data workflows of whatever type that is, if they get popped, you now are no longer using identity as a service or cloud access security brokers or whoever it is. You're basically using a man in the middle as a service. That's what you're paying for at the moment.
Exactly. We've got a couple of questions here about market share. Some folks are asking about, ping relative to other ones that are out there. And ping's another one. Ping sort of had its identity, literally, it's just funny. Ping had an identity crisis. They thought that they were going to be an acquisition target of Microsoft when Microsoft was trying to get into the cloud and federated identity market. And so they sort of became that bridge between on-premise Active Directory and cloud identity for federation purposes. And they kind of got left behind in the dust when Microsoft decided to do their own thing. But Ping, I think, is probably second out there. Okta, Ping, you see other ones out there, IDAP, and that sort of thing. But I mean, they all suffer from the same problem. When you put so many identities in one place, it becomes a significant challenge to protect that stuff. And then,
Exactly.
you think about, the folks who claim to do adaptive authentication, folk duo out there, all of them are vulnerable to simple IP address manipulation when you come to say, okay, well, I'm going to only limit certain people from certain places to get in. And when you're relying on an IP address to drive adaptive authentication, I mean, I don't know, is it very hard to find a VPN that can spoof your IP address? I don't know, is that difficult?
Not that hard. Turns out, not that hard.
Not that hard. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you think about other things that are going on out there. What we're doing at Highside is we're trying to solve these problems by developing the world's first distributed identity encryption platform, which basically says, look, let's let people take advantage of the power of the cloud, but not have to give up your keys to another provider so that someone could either backdoor you or use a lawful intercept request to basically go and get access to your data. And so what focusing on is, making sure that when someone uses Highside for the first time, they were in control of all their encryption keys from day one. There's no need to bring your own key because you generated your own keys. We never had access to it. And because we never have access to those encryption secrets, even if we did get a court order, all we can do is go shrug our shoulders and go, well, you need to go talk to them because they have their keys. And so by having this distributed identity and encryption platform, it lets us do high security messaging, file transfer, voice and video. We've actually developed a Microsoft Teams encryption plugin. So where if you are forced to use Teams and you don't want to allow people to read data flowing through there, you can actually use our encryption mechanism to basically encrypt everything that flows through Microsoft Teams from a messaging and file sharing perspective. We're doing some interesting multi-factor authentication with Palo Alto, where we're using true location data such as GPS signals, radio frequency identifiers from cell tower transponders, and even doing some integrations with folks like Iridium, the satellite location network out there, to basically make someone prove where they are at before they go through the adaptive authentication process. And we've also been doing some enhanced email hygiene to make sure that attackers don't abuse the trust of email to try to bypass our protections. When it comes to our approach to things, we've basically been saying, look, all of these other systems out there, they essentially are single points of failure. So whenever you put all of your eggs in one basket with these other providers, they become weaknesses that can be easily exploited. And so what we've been trying to do is say, look, let's let people retain control of all of their stuff through email security, ultra secure collaboration, and then high integrity MFA. And we've gotten some good awards over the last year. We won the regional competition for the 2020 Startup World Cup. And we basically have a group of security professionals with decades of experience that have played on both sides, right? So, my background background, as you know, Dave, I did a little bit of work government back in the day, and basically knew some of the dirty tricks to be played when it would come to doing communications intercept. And we've actually tried to build the system so people don't have to have single points of failure in their trust situation. But people can go and check out some of those things. We're getting a bunch of questions now that I think we should probably dig into. We've got one question here where it says, when you look at Zoom, outside experts, do you see this as window dressings? PR is substantive. Katie Masuri and Luda have great experience in bug bounty, for example. Does it matter if development remains in the PRC? So as I mentioned before, if you have development in the People's Republic of China, and if you are creating encryption keys that will be used in your platform, if you want to maintain your regulatory compliance in China, meaning that you're in good standing where you can still have employees there, you have to share the key material. And so while they have made an acquisition of Keybase to try to decrease that, I think that is truly window dressing. And so that's my perspective on that. Do you want to add anything to that, Dave?
Well, it's funny. I was actually going to bring that up. Obviously, that's the big news of the day, is that they just recently acquired Keybase. They're, having this big sort of dog and pony show about how they're going to generate the world's largest end-to-end encryption infrastructure, et cetera. But nowhere in any of that, sort of flashy marketing and PR does it remind everybody that they still have, keys disseminated across China with the government there. Like I can't believe they're not bringing that up in their public relations and marketing materials. But yeah, nonetheless, all kidding aside, I think it's a good move. And them basically going and hiring Alex Stamos and all those guys, that are big wigs in the world of the security community to say, hey, you're going to advise us and make sure we're saying and doing the right things. I mean, I think that all sounds great. But I think it all, you do have to come back to the central point here. All their R&D is in China. They have these very strong bindings and links to the Chinese government and folks over there. I don't think you can sort of separate those, right? Again, it all sounds good, but to your point, it feels a little bit like window dressing until that underlying issue is addressed.
Yeah, and there's another question about Zoom Gov. So one of the things that people have to realize is that Zoom Gov, all that's happened are the switchboard servers are moved to a FedRAMP cloud. And so there's no inherent improved encryption or protection in the Zoom Gov platform. And so they're still using the same protections that the rest of the Zoom system has. They're just using a FedRAMP as the switchboard on the back end, which doesn't really provide the same, any level of improved security. So I'm trying my best to make it through all of these questions that we're getting right here. So if we think about the ability of Microsoft Authenticator, there's a question in here about how does Microsoft Authenticator play into all this. So when you store your authentication keys in one place, so for example, if you're doing synchronization of Active Directory on-prem to Azure AD, essentially you are relying on a single point of failure in the Microsoft cloud. And so by having all of that in one location, it still suffers from some of the problems that Okta does, well, all of the problems. And in fact, we've seen in the past where people have legacy versions of Active Directory, like Active Directory, 2008 functional level, combined with AD Sync up to Office 365. We've actually seen brute force attacks work where people are able to brute force the Office 365 credentials because of vulnerabilities that exist in the 2008 version of Active Directory. And so people have to understand that when you put, again, your eggs in one basket there are going to be some problems down the road. Dave, have you seen any situations where authenticators had problems?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, again, to me, this isn't necessarily a new issue, right? I mean, we've seen those problems kind of consistently and persistently over the years. I think there's a lot of factors that are making them more prevalent now, right? You're seeing a lot more sort of straining and busting at the seams. You see a lot more attacks coming against these. I mean, look, we've been talking about this for years, and it's the same old thing playing out once again, just in a different way. Attackers aren't stupid. That they shift focus to go after things that are now critical elements of the sort of workflow and business operations chains, and this is just the exact same thing happening all over again.
Yeah, and one of the problems that we found with Authenticator, we were dealing in an instant response situation where an organization had required multi-factor authentication using Microsoft Authenticator. Global admin, Office 365 global admin went traveling. While they were traveling overseas, bad guys in foreign country compromised the iPhone that the MFA was on, cloned the Microsoft Authenticator MFA, and then used it to go do all sorts of badness. They turned on the Exchange Online what's it called? The forensics tools. So basically, when you do a legal hold on someone's email inbox, they turn on all the forensics tools in Exchange Online on the executives, and we're dumping the email real time off of their own stuff through Microsoft Flow. And so, if you ever want to know exactly what's going on inside of a company, basically build a wiretap on the CFO, CEOs, and CEOs inbox, and you have a pretty good idea of what's going on. And that's what they did because they were able to compromise the Microsoft Authenticator MFA off of an iPhone. So there was one question, do you have links or resources available to us to research some of the claims? If you want to follow up with me, my address is aaron@highside.io. Happy to share the reports. Most of them are shared through the IONS research website. Both Dave and I do collaborative work on research there, and that's where most of non-vendor related claims are, and happy to share those links if you shoot me an email. One question, can Highside be used in a NIST 800-171 DFAR 7012? Yes, we have been using Highside in that environment, and basically on an Azure GovCloud basis and an AWS GovCloud basis as well. Let's see here, just trying to read these as they come in. Okay. You've mentioned a lot of consumer messaging nightmares. Are there any messaging services that you'd trust based upon security encryption? Obviously, I work for one of those companies. Our application is freely available right now. You can download it as part of our response to the COVID situation. Our messaging and file sharing is completely free right now, and so you can download the application and use it. The only information that we get when you download the app is we do ask for an email address that at the end of the trial period, which will probably be at the end of this calendar year, we'll ask someone to say, hey, do you want to using this and who wants to pay for it? But through the end of 2020, we're going to be offering it for free. I think that I've gone through all of the questions that I have in the Q&A. We still have plenty of time here, so please feel free to send those in through the system. So Dave, from your perspective, if you take a look at the next, I don't know, year and a half, right? Let's imagine you and I are having hopefully a meal face-to-face in a nice restaurant in December of 21. What's the situation going to be like from a security and collaboration perspective? What do you think is going to be like over the next little while?
Well, I think, first off, I think if you just look at the business side of this, I mean, to take one step back, I think there were a lot of organizations out there that had functionally enabled some remote access and remote work, but I think they're seeing the opportunity to do that more and perhaps better. And I think that's going to play out dramatically over the next 18 months, right? And I think that's going to shape a lot of this, because what once might have been considered a nice-to-have technology, or maybe an important one, but not necessarily mission-critical, now will be. And that's going to be driving all sorts of cost reduction efforts. You're going to be seeing this definitively play out as part of disaster recovery scenarios, even more than it was. You're going to find all sorts of new business-oriented use cases that are going to be pushing this right into the forefront. And necessarily, that's going to be right on the radar now of risk assessment professionals, compliance professionals, and of course, security engineering folks that have to go figure out what this stuff does and really how they're going to make use of it in the most secure fashion. So I think it is going to bubble up dramatically to the surface. And I think some of the people that had been previously going to work and sitting in a cubicle or an office or what have you aren't going to be doing that anymore. I think you're going to see new whole swaths of the workforce that have now become remote workers, and that's going to drive this. Now, back to your point though, Aaron, I think availability is still going to be the biggest focus. People are going to say redundancy, availability, basically the capability to expand and sort of support this, this new larger workforce that we're, putting into a remote situation is still going to be the number one thing everybody looks at. But I certainly think the more regulated organizations out there are going to be starting to pay closer attention. Again, I think the circumstances we're in were odd, right? They were unusual. Things happened, very, very quickly. People made some, trade-offs or some choices that, maybe they're going to have to go back and really revisit. But I don't think that will stick. I think people are going to start really paying close attention to this, much more so than they have in the past 3 months, say.
Yeah. I was on a webcast 2 weeks ago with a doctor by the name of Dr. David Ganjemi, and he was actually the guy who led the Ebola response back 20 years ago, more. And in that webcast, he was talking about how this health event is different on many fronts. It's different because of the lack of collaboration that took place early on between Chinese medical researchers and the rest of the world, and so people are at a disadvantage relative to information. It's different because it is a new type of virus relative to what has been researched in the past, and so there's all of this uncertainty. And in an era of uncertainty, what people try to do is they try to find certainty, and so people migrate towards the thing that works. And like you say, Zoom and those tools just work. And a lot of times people err on the side of, hey, I'm just trying to get work done here because I don't want to be in the next round of layoffs. I want to protect my position in the company, so I'm just going to try to get my stuff done. And unfortunately, I think it's going to put a lot of information at risk in ways that was never done before. This is the first time in 30 years of working in this industry that I've ever seen a Fortune 10 company allow for their security operations center to be removed. Most of the time, that the SOC team is in a bunker, and when they're dealing with truly sensitive information, it is constrained physically to that location. But now, we've seen it over and over again. People have had to get work done. The health situation is uncertain. Companies do not want to suffer the liability of bringing those workers back and potentially exposing them to some health risk. And I think we're going to see, whenever people on the side of availability, we know what will happen. Information will be lost, and it will result in, unfortunately, significant problems to organizations. So from your experience, from your perspective, Dave, where do you see security teams heading when it comes to trying to train people about using things well? Like, what is there a way to get in front of this runaway train right now?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the big headache, honestly, is the enablement factor, right? In terms of, how do you position this? And I think, and I'm sad to say this, I think some organizations are not going to have necessarily the staffing and operational capacity to really go out there and do what I would say is the best job at implementation, right? I think they're going to, at least, sort of piece it together over the course of the next year, just to try to get people, capable, able to work, sort of making sure that they're marching forward. But I think trying to sort of build the most secure fashion of operation, I think that's going to take time. I think it's going to be a constraint just in terms of people and probably having to go back and adapt the sort of, education and dissemination of information appropriately across the organization. I think that's going to be tough. I think it's going to be hard. And I think to some degree, there are going to be organizations that just throw their hands up and they go, yeah, let's just keep using the easy thing. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I just think that's probably going to be the case, at least for some of them out there.
Well, I had an in-depth conversation with another friend of ours, Peter Cooper, a couple of weeks ago. And I was talking with Peter about the financial implications of everything that's going on right now. And one of the ideas that we put together was, prior to 1929, most small towns had their own electrical generation facility, where every little town had their own little electrical plant, and everyone had wires running from that electrical plant out. Well, after the 1929 crash, you see the Hoover Dam get built, Grand Coulee Dam, the Tennessee Valley Authority, massive consolidation of electrical generation facilities for utilities. I think 2020 moment where on-prem IT goes poof. That essentially most organizations, because of cost factors, because of downsizing, because of efficiencies and optimization, I think on-prem IT is going to be sort of a thing of the past. And so we're going to see massive rolling forward of these cloud-based systems. But unfortunately, most organizations are going to do it in a way where they don't properly do the risk assessments to go, well, what does it mean if I use an unencrypted S3 container to store all of my sensitive data? What does it mean where I use a simple username and password for my privileged AWS accounts? And because of that rush towards the cloud, because of cost concerns and efficiency needs, I think we're going to see a massive wave of data breaches because of the shift away from on-prem IT, because it's too expensive and you aren't able to keep the people around to keep it running. And I think it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's already happening, right? I mean, that's already happening. I think your point is it's going to accelerate it in a lot of ways, right? You're going to see more organizations. I mean, who's going to go position an on-prem Exchange server now, right?
Yeah.
Who wanted that to begin with? I mean, I think, Microsoft's brilliant evil plan was, let's make this wretched on-prem thing that eventually we just servicize, and then we, keep them hooked, but they don't even have to run it anymore. And so it's like, okay, well, here we go. I think the same thing can be said, for you're going to see more voice collaboration. I think you're going to see integration of a lot of these services, and every single one of those integration points creates a potential weakness. I think you're going to see APIs starting to get extended that nobody has a clue about to try to integrate these platforms with other workflow tools. I think the ecosystem is going to get even bigger, and that threat surface is going to get larger, and there's not going to be a lot of attention paid to it, at least not in the short term.
One thing about your conspiratorial theory about Microsoft, I was on the Exchange team in the late 90s. Let me tell you that you should rest assured that we were having enough problems keeping our servers running with I love you and Melissa viruses. We didn't have time to think about an evil plan. There was no such time for that.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of other questions in here, more about comparisons with other. I think it's probably more appropriate that we follow up offline as far as point to point on specific features and benefits of our stuff versus others. But Dave, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Always a good excuse to be able to get together. Too bad it's virtually. Love to, hopefully at some point in time we can see each other in person in the future, in a day, and properly socially distanced and properly protecting our health and well-being. So anything else you'd like to add before we wrap it up, Dave?
No, I mean, the only thing I'll say is, I think this is the topic of the hour, obviously, right? And I think it's important for organizations out there to basically plan once these things settle down, right? I think we're still in a mode of sort of reaction and sort of a knee-jerk stage of many organizations. And to be fair, this whole thing will start to shake out by the end of the year globally, right? I mean, regardless of where you guys are listening in from, I think, your country or state or what have you, things are going to start lightening up. And so you're going to start to see some shift back to what we used to know as normal, whatever that is. When that happens, don't forget that this is now something that really needs the attention, right? I think that's the only thing I really am cautioning people. Don't be lulled into this sense that, oh yeah, we can go back to quote unquote normal. With regards to work and operations of how that work gets done, there is no going back that way, which means that, again, to the point, I think this type of technology is something that we really have got to scrutinize heavily, more so than it ever has been in the past.
Yeah, it is sad that I think we have entered a new normal. There is no hitting the reset button and going back to a pre-COVID world, at least until we've got much better certainty around the public health consequences. And, for those of us, I think the people who are being impacted by this the most are the young people of the world, the people who are like, juniors and seniors in high school and college kids and that sort of thing, where they're seeing futures evaporate and people are becoming despondent. I think the most hopeful message I would have for people who are listening is that, the world is what you make it. And if you can figure out how to do things faster and more securely and become a trusted advisor to businesses, there will be a future, because people have to get business done. Business will continue, regardless of how many shutdowns and how many lockdowns and how many countries close their borders. The business community is going to figure something out. And so I think my message of hope in, sort of these darkish times of public health risks is that, as security professionals, we We need to make sure that we offer solutions that provide the level of availability that people expect, but with the security, confidentiality, integrity controls that are needed to properly protect information. And so hopefully those of you listening on this webinar today are able to walk away with some of that. All of the contact information for Highside can be found on our website. As I mentioned, we have freely available downloads for our messaging application today to help people communicate securely. And for people who want things like enhanced multi-factor authentication, enhanced voice and video, high security voice and video, those are things that we're more than happy to work with you on a commercial basis. But really appreciate your time and attention, Dave.
Yeah, great chatting with you too, Aaron. And thanks everybody for joining.
Carol, we'll pitch it back to you.
All right, thank you so much, Aaron and Dave, for your great presentation, and to Highside for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.